Good evening and welcome to this evening's episode of Learn Live UAE. It still shocks me a little bit, actually, that Mark and I have been at this now for 1 year, 2 months. Thank you to all of you that have supported, guests that have come on the show, people that have watched either live or watched back. It blows my mind a little bit. We've had over 85 different educators in 14 months across the UAE come onto the show to share their learning, their experience, their context. And I'm hugely proud of that, actually, come to think of it, and reflecting on last week's episode with the Women Ed MENA team about being 10% braver. And I think actually putting this out there 14 months ago was definitely, I think, my 10% braver. I can't speak on Mark's behalf there. He's a little bit more confident in front of the camera than I am. But anyway, a big thank you very much to all the supporters of the show. And it's fantastic to carry on. Tonight's episode, however, is the last of season 2, the last of this academic year. We're going to switch it up a little bit for the next academic year. And it won't be the weekly show. We're going to do something slightly different, but we'll announce that. We've got plans in progress over the summer, I think. But without further ado, as always, you're not here for me, you're here for our guest. Tonight on the show, it is an absolute pleasure. And I'd like to say a public thank you to Ginette as well, not only for giving up her time, but for rearranging, because she was meant to come on the show a couple of weeks ago and I had to rearrange. That was my issue. So thank you, Ginette. And she's going to talk to us about leading inclusion in an international context. We're all leaders of learning, we're all leaders of literacy, oracy, and actually I believe that we're all leaders of inclusion. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Ginette into the show. Ginette, good evening.
Hi, thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much for coming along. How's your week been?
Very, very busy. It's that time of the year when there's just a great deal to do. One of the things I've been doing this year, which is a bit of a first for us, is having team around the child review meetings for all of our children with the most significant needs. And it's been demanding, but really, really rewarding to just connect with parents and the other people that support them. It's been fantastic to hear how well they've done.
I think that's really rewarding, not only for the parents, but the students as well. You know, that triangulation of information and, you know, school, student, parent is so important in schools. How was that received? Was it received really positively?
Yeah, really, really good uptake. And it's just helping us plan for next year. What does next year need to look like for those children who've got a lot of support, and just a chance to celebrate their successes. And sometimes it's difficult to find time for that. So it's been really valuable. Yeah,
it's quite often my experience in other schools, not in the Middle East, but back home, is you only tend to celebrate at the end of a term. And actually there are so many other pinpoint marks across the school year where we could celebrate, and it's great to have that cumulative kind of success at the end of the year. But I think we could all probably do a little bit more to celebrate success constantly across all of our classrooms. I know that, hand on my heart, I could probably do a little bit more of that, and I think I should, on reflection, actually, thinking back to next year.
Sometimes that's almost where school social media comes in, because perhaps one of my inclusion teachers will say, oh, it was fantastic today. The child did this, and look, and this is his work, and look at this. He's so happy, he really enjoyed it. And I'd go, send the photo to marketing, you know, because that's something to be celebrated by us. And it's easy perhaps to miss those children that you do the things that you do in class, like we're having a special themed week at the moment. Our fantastic marketing lady, Harriet's been going around with her camera looking for what's happening in the classrooms, what is there that we can all celebrate. And sometimes the children that we work with, their successes can be quite small, but really, really important. You know, if there's the children that I work with, learning to take your shoes on and off is a big step. No pun intended. Yeah. So we celebrate everything. And I said, I want that on our social media as well. It reflects our school population, not just what's happening in those regular mainstream classrooms.
Yeah, I think that's really important as well, to kind of reframe what success looks like, because it's different for different people at different stages and different ages. So it's really nice to hear that. We do things that I already want to ask you, but for anybody that's watching or that hasn't followed you on social media, could you just introduce yourself, Ginette? Tell us a bit about your journey in education so far and your current role.
Yes, I've been teaching for just over 20 years. It wasn't the first thing I did when I left school. I actually really wanted to be a nurse when I was growing up, so I left school and that's just what I did. And after about a year and a half, I knew that really wasn't for me. So fell into office work and part-time study, and then gradually, after taking on a training role, decided to head in a teaching direction. And suddenly here I am 20 years later in a country 7 hours flight away from where I used to live, with my husband, starting a new life here, and now head of inclusion at the Aquila School in Dubai, which is owned by ISP, the International Schools Partnership. So I think one of the things that really helps there is being part of a bigger group and not just a standalone school.
Yeah, it certainly has its perks, I think, being part of a larger group and wider network. I know that of my own kind of current context. What made you make the leap? Lots of people do go internationally, and I'm always keen to find out, what was it that kind of sparked that, do you know what, I'm going to go and teach internationally?
It was one of the things that was sort of a bit on the bucket list, really, and it's very strange to now be living in a place where we used to go on holiday. So I first came to Dubai in 2010, and we came here on an almost annual basis for many years after that. And my husband always said, I'd love to go and work there. He'd done some contract work out here, was really keen on making it a permanent move if the right opportunity came up at the right time. And luckily for us, especially for him, really, because it was almost a case of, okay, what do we do? Shall I look for a job and then you look for a job? Or shall I get a job and then you get a job? And we had to make that decision, as a working but not a teaching couple. We had to see if everything just fell into place at the right time. And luckily for us, it did. And although he's since changed his job here, it really has been absolutely the right move for us.
I remember when I first moved out here, a bit of advice I got, or I didn't ask for it, I was given it, as sometimes family members do, is, you're not going there for a holiday. But actually, I'm kind of 3 years in, and quite often when it's the weekend or, not term time, it still does feel a little bit like I'm on holiday, and it's quite a nice, lucky, place to live. We've had a comment come in from Al. Thank you, Al. As chair of an alternative provision academy, it's lovely to hear Ginette talking about celebrating the achievements, no matter how small. Thank you, Al, for tuning in, as always, a big supporter of the show. Ginette, with kind of your inclusion hat on, I know that you're involved in lots of different networks. We were talking before going live about our kind of, I guess, primary social network, myself being Twitter and yourself being LinkedIn. Could you tell us a little bit about the inclusion networks that you're involved in the UAE, specifically the Special Needs and Inclusion Teachers Network in the Middle East and Africa?
Yeah, that's quite a sort of a recent addition. And like you, I think I'm more primarily Twitter. I'm relatively new to LinkedIn, but it sort of, sometimes perhaps I'm just not that techie. Sometimes it's easier to share stuff on there and to share it to the right audience, and to feel if you want to bang on about inclusion, I'm afraid I do that quite a lot, I'm there preaching to the converted. And if you want to just share a photo of the view over the balcony, as I did at the weekend, then you can do that on Twitter, and I won't do it on LinkedIn. So the Special Needs and Inclusion Teachers Network is actually primarily a Facebook group, and I'm not a Facebook user, so I also do a lot of work on the LinkedIn side of that. So it's a private group designed for, we say special needs and inclusion teachers. In fact, some of the people that have joined, who are very welcome to join us there, are perhaps what may often be known in this area as a shadow teacher, a one-to-one, or a learning support assistant. So you don't have to be a teacher, but you need to be in the region and you need to be involved in the field of special education. And it's a steering committee of inclusion leaders in various schools in the Middle East, mostly in Dubai, but also we have Julie, who's in Jeddah. And we do a number of events, live Q&As and webinars. We have guest speakers. I did a webinar a few weeks ago. And the aim is just to try and share our expertise and a bit like tonight, give people the chance to comment and participate as well, and just host discussions.
And for those people that want to get involved, you've mentioned that it's primarily a kind of Facebook group, what do they need to search for, and how can they get involved with the group?
Search for, it's a long one, Special Needs and Inclusion Teachers Network.
Okay.
And if you search that up, you will find the Facebook group. I understand, again, as a non-Facebook user, cannot comment in detail. But also, if somebody were to find me on LinkedIn and wants to message me on there, I can certainly invite them to join the group.
And you mentioned that there's kind of webinars, Q&A, all sorts of professional learning and just dialogue, discussion, open. What kind of sparked, I guess, the creation of this group by the steering committee?
Well, it sort of formed in reverse almost, because it was the brainchild of Rania, who works for the Lecture and Reading Centre in Dubai. So they're one of the special needs assessments and tuition centres here. And she emailed the contacts that she had in schools locally and said, I'd really love to set this up. Would you be interested in being a part of it? And I said, tell me what's involved. And then she said, it's going to be a Facebook group. I went, I don't do Facebook. I'd love to be involved, but I don't do Facebook. So let's see about how we can make it work, because there are lots of people in a professional capacity who, I mean, I don't want to get the settings wrong. I'd rather just stay away from it rather than inadvertently share my private life. You know what it's like. You do not know what your parents and older pupils are going to find out about you through social media. So I just keep off it for safety's sake. And it was something like, how can we make this work? So there were enough of us on Facebook for it to work that way. And we make sure that those of us who aren't keep involved. So if you're not a Facebook user, just set up a LinkedIn profile and join us there instead.
That's nice that you're kind of living the values there of, whilst it might not be everybody's kind of social site, you're enabling access through other professional networks or social media kind of action sites, I guess is probably the correct way of phrasing it. You've got a presentation for us. Mindful of time, we're already at past. Time flies amazingly quickly. Do you want to start sharing a screen, and should we jump into your presentation? Just whilst Ginette's sharing her screen, if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to fire them in via the comments, or if anything resonates, please do also send in some comments. It's great to get a bit of participation. Okay, here we go. I'll just bring your slides up. Here we go. Okay, take it away.
Thank you. There's just a bit of biography for me. As I said, it was not my first job. I'm not one of those people who said, when I grow up, I'm going to be a teacher and go straight into it. So I did lots of other office-y type jobs as well before that, and then moved into training and then into teaching. One of the things that is just something that's just me, and that's how I am, is I'm a lifelong learner. So I did my first master's in education part-time while teaching, and finished that one in 2006. And as a primary teacher, especially working in small schools, 2 of the schools I've worked in are 1-form entry schools. And that means that you wear several hats, and mostly several hats at once. So I've led lots of different subjects. Took my first SLT role in 2008 when I was leading literacy and early years and key stage 1 in a West London school. And then the opportunity came up to take a post in a school that was much nearer to my house and didn't involve crossing what seemed like all the major roads in North London in order to get to work. And it involved being a class teacher and Senko. And up until that point, I hadn't really thought about moving into that field at all. And one of the opportunities about it that appealed for me is that the existing Senko was the deputy head in the school, and she wasn't going anywhere. So I knew I could start in the post, and I would have a mentor and somebody to lean on and somebody to learn from. And so that's what made it really a successful first year for me. So I started my National Award for Sen Coordination. It was one of the very early cohorts then, and finished that in 2012. And then my husband said, I'm going to do a master's, and I had my Senko award, which is a third of it. And I said, well, if you're going to do that, then I might as well do the rest of it, because then we'll both be studying at once. So I did another 2 years of study, and that led me to a master's in special and inclusive education. I moved on then from that outstanding primary school to another South London school as deputy head, and had only been there what seemed like about 6 weeks before my husband had a phone call from a headhunter that eventually led to us relocating to Dubai. As I've said, I can't imagine doing anything else now. I may have done several other things before I got to this point, but this is me until retirement now. And one of the other things that I started doing at the beginning of last year was I also tutor the National Award for SEND Coordination and the International SENCO courses for real training, which has led to me learning a lot as well. It's a really worthwhile thing to do alongside my students. So where I am right now, I'm at the Aquila School in Dubai, which only opened in 2018 with fewer than 70 pupils, and we expect to have over 900 next year, and we'll then be opening year 9 as well. So I've got 52 pupils on our register at the moment, and I don't call it a SEND register, it's an additional learning needs register, as not all of them have diagnosed needs. And in our school, we work in partnership with the Hammam Centre, and they provide therapeutic support for pupils with moderate to severe autism, as well as providing some speech and language and OT therapy to some of our mainstream pupils. We're a British curriculum school rated outstanding by BSO very early in our first year, just in April 2019. And one of the few things that I can thank COVID for is that we've not had our KHDA inspection yet, which would normally been in our third year, so that would have been this year. So just moving on to inclusion, what it looks like for me and for our school and what's important to us. This is a picture that some of you may be familiar with. There are various versions of it, and in some of them, on the exclusion one, there are lots and lots of those coloured dots around the outside of the circle, where the red dots representing the children with additional needs who are outside that mainstream setting and perhaps have no place to belong to at all. And the reason I like this version of it is because almost without exception, if you count carefully, those red dots actually do appear eventually inside that circle. So you may have a separation model where you've got those children who are in a setting, but it's nothing to do with that green dot mainstream setting. What's more common here in Dubai and perhaps in other parts of the UAE is the integration model, where you have a group of children who have their own class, their own teacher, who are on the same site, and will occasionally go to some other things with other people in the school. And what we aim to have at my school is as close to the inclusion model as we can manage. For me, it's what everybody should inspire to, so that all of our children, regardless of their level of need, are part of a mainstream class. They have a mainstream class teacher, they have a seat in that classroom. That's the teacher who writes their reports. Yes, it may be in collaboration with other people who support that child's learning. They have a class teacher and are fully involved in everything that we do as a school as much as they can be. This is something that's really, really valued by our families and by the pupils themselves, who get to be a part of everything that's going on. And it's important to remember that there's no negative impact of pupils with special needs being included in mainstream schools if they're effectively supported. It's up to us to make it work. So this is a quote from Linda Graham's book about international perspectives on inclusion. And she said, inclusive education is more than a set of practices. It's also a philosophy. It's a way of thinking about people, diversity, learning, and teaching. And that's something that really resonates with me. And here's something that Olly, you can try, and anybody else who's watching. I'm sure that, especially if you're from the UK, you've heard of Darren Brown. You may also have heard of Professor Richard Wiseman, who's an experimental psychologist and also a magician. And he said, you need to use your pointing finger and draw a capital letter Q on your forehead. So just as you would the circle and the tail sticking out the side. And then stop and think about what you just did. If you drew the tail of the Q over your right eye, then that letter Q looks correct to you. But if you drew it so that the tail of the Q is over your left eye, then it looks correct to others. And the reason you would do that, and I think maybe this should be something that's part of the recruitment process for inclusion staff, if you've written it over your left eye, then that capital letter Q looks right to other people. It means that perhaps you are a person who thinks about others' perspective rather than your own. And I have to say, when I heard this, it was on a Darren Brown podcast, and I thought, okay, I'm going to try that. And that's exactly what I did. And I thought just maybe there's a connection there between the sort of role that I do and the values that I have, and thinking about how it's what other people experience is what's really important for me. This is a conversation that we've had even in our leadership team meeting at school this week. I don't accept a determinist view of pupil ability. And my hackles go up every time I hear somebody say low ability. Oh, the low ability children, I'm doing this for the low ability group. You know, the days of three-way differentiation should be well behind us. It's important that we think about what we can do so that children can succeed, rather than deciding what it is that they can do. And also, when we're thinking about the language they use for children with additional learning needs, we don't use, and this is something I've corrected when I'm marking assignments as part of my iSenko and NASenko tutoring. I don't want to see the words send children, or perhaps what's even worse, send parents. These are parents of children with additional needs or with special needs. They're children with special needs. Rather than saying the autistic boy, you could say the boy with autism. And then if the child's old enough and able to have a conversation with you about that, you can actually say to them, how would you like me to talk about your needs? So it's not for me to decide what language I use about you. It's for you to decide what language I use when I need to talk and write about you. So thinking about what matters when leading inclusion, it's a long list. I think most schools, especially here, existed before the inclusion of other groups was considered, and their academic and social structures were well established. And we need to redesign those schools to promote and facilitate inclusion. And I think perhaps that's one thing that's been easier for us as a new school only 3 years ago, is that we've set it up like that from the beginning. Since I joined the school, it's been, almost a mission that I just can't stop myself. It's just about who we are. And that's a really important thing for me. But I can't do that on my own. It has to be a whole school ethos. And I'm very, very fortunate in the leadership team that we have at school, that it's the same shared vision for everybody. It's not just something that I'm doing on a crusade. It's what we all want to achieve. Belonging has two faces. It's how others perceive the individual and how the individual perceives themselves and their perception of how others perceive them. So you want everybody in your school to feel that they belong. So we have some children who get support from the Hammam Centre. Sometimes, just for shortcuts, I might refer to them as the Hammam children. And I try and stop myself from doing that, because they're children who have support from the Hammam Centre. That just takes up a lot more words. But what's really important to me is that those children belong just as much. Everybody in our school belongs just as much, so that they wear the same uniform. They come to school at the same time. They do all of the things that we do. And as I said about social media, they should be just as visible as everybody else is. Schools that were created as inclusive, where every child belongs and is valued, can foster closer relationships between all groups and ensure that the appropriate accommodations are made without any judgments. And we're fortunate in Dubai to have a framework for inclusion, but there isn't one in every region. I know that the Abu Dhabi one, for example, is different, and you'll find even within the UAE there are different frameworks or lacks of frameworks in each of the Emirates. And as part of my tutoring on the International Senko course, I've been supporting some students who've been in that situation where there simply isn't a framework. For example, one in Gibraltar, who is her school's, and you wouldn't think this in 2020, her school's first ever Senko. They've never had one before because there is no equivalent to the UK Code of Practice for children with special needs. So she's starting from the ground up. And similarly, I have a student in Italy who's in a bilingual school where they're running their local curriculum and the Cambridge English curriculum. And so she, again, is the first ever Senko. She's the only person in the department. There is no framework for inclusion. There is no structure. And she's working very hard to get things set up. So if you're in a situation like we are in Dubai, where you have a framework to work from, that's a lot easier. And if there isn't, you need to borrow from others and create your own. It's important to walk in the child's shoes. I don't look at teachers' lesson plans. I can look at lesson plans. It won't tell me what experience that child's actually going to have. So if I want to find out how successful we are including a child in our school and meeting their needs, firstly, I'm going to go and talk to them. But also, I'm going to go in their classroom and be a part of their experience in there. And I might go and watch them in PE and see how they cope in that situation, how that teacher's meeting their needs. I might go into the playground with them. I'll go into the Arabic class, even if it's the Arabic class for native speakers and I don't understand what's going on, just to see what experiences they're having there. And then you have a better idea of whether their needs are being met or not. And if they're not, what you can do about it. We start with the child and their needs. I said some of our children don't have a diagnosis. Some will probably never have one. I'm not saying that a diagnosis is something that should be desirable. And there'll always be a mix of those with and those without. A lack of diagnosis could be just down to simply the wishes of the parent. They don't want to pursue it. It could be that they can't afford to go and get their child assessed and screened. It could be a cultural decision that they don't like the stigma of having a child with special needs. The only thing that matters is the child has their needs met and that you're able to identify what those are as best that you can with the resources that you have, because the label doesn't change the child. The child is who they are. Recognizing strengths and not just difficulties. One of the advantages we have with the KHDA framework here in Dubai is that it does ask you about the strengths. You need to look at all areas of their learning. And I think it's really important that we start with their strengths and their aspirations before you start to look at the things that they find difficult. This is something that's always really important to me, and people who know me well and have seen me around the inclusion leaders groups here will know this is something that I'm always an advocate of. I said the only restraint that you need is self-restraint. We don't have a restraint policy in my school. We don't need one. We don't restrain our children. It doesn't matter what they are doing. We need to handle that. And we've actually adopted what's called the low arousal approach, which supports us as staff managing and changing the way that we respond to a child's challenging behaviour so that we can recognise it for what it is. It's a stress response. We need to manage how we support them in that moment of stress. And I could give you as an example, we have a parent who vividly describes seeing her 5-year-old son with autism being restrained at school. And that haunts her. And I wouldn't want to put a parent through that. There is no need. Would you as a parent want that experience for your child, whether they had additional learning needs or not? If you wouldn't restrain your own children, I think then you don't restrain other people's either. The heart of the inclusive classroom is simply good teaching. It's not magic. What works for children with special needs works for everybody. For example, this could be having vocabulary for particular topics on display, giving simple instructions, making sure those instructions are somewhere the child can see them even after you finish talking, giving them lots of different ways of sharing their ideas, showing their learning, getting help when they need it, supporting and planning for transitions, not just at the end of the year, but between lessons, between different parts of the lessons. And consistency. So when, as we often do in our private schools here, children have teachers for different subjects, then what works for them in that setting is something that can also be adopted in other settings as well. Then we essentially come back to ethos again. You have to believe it's possible. So we always ask, what do we need to do so that our school works for this child? It's really important to be flexible and adaptable and responsive to what the child needs. And when I do admissions interviews with parents and I ask them this question, they usually look at me open-mouthed and go very, very quiet, because I don't think anybody's ever asked them that before. The expectation in their minds is usually that they need to fit around the school, their child needs to fit around the school, that nobody at the school is going to be willing to make sure the school fits around the child and works for them. There's a couple of things I'm going to whiz through quite quickly because they are not mine. I do not want to take any credit for them. Daniel Sobel, who runs the Inclusion Expert site, and a good friend of his, Sarah Alston, both of whom you can find on Twitter, have a book called The Inclusive Classroom, which was published earlier this year. This is one of the things that you'll find in there. And if, as a teacher or an inclusion leader, you're thinking about how do I know that what's happening in my school is good practice in inclusive teaching, here are some examples that you can look at, which are taken from the book. And also they talk through the 5 lesson phases. So at each point, thinking about the best practice in inclusion. And again, I said this comes from Daniel and Sarah's book, so I will take no credit for it. And it also, as part of the book, it's on their website, the Bloomsbury website. They have a downloadable checklist for inclusive practice, which could be useful for teachers and for inclusion leaders. It might be that if you're somebody who's on the leadership team in your school, if you're just going into class to support a teacher who's perhaps saying, please, can you give me some help with meeting this child's needs? I'm not sure I'm doing the best thing for them. That checklist could be helpful for both of you to think about, am I doing everything that I can be doing to help that child be successful? So my top tips: never stop learning. I haven't stopped. I'm still studying, as well as being a real student, a real training tutor at the moment. I am also a real training student because I'm doing the access arrangements course at the moment. Well, I say at the moment, I'm pretty busy, so not fitting a lot in, but it's one of the things I'm going to have done by the end of the summer. And certainly in Dubai, the University of Birmingham, Dubai, have some excellent special needs courses, which some people might find interesting to have a look at. And the real training courses, as well as doing the International Senko Award, which is a master's level 1-year course, there are also lots of other subject-specific training that you can do. So keep learning, keep an open mind. If you've taught one child with autism, then you have taught one child with autism. We don't know everything, and I will never know everything, and every child that I meet will have different needs, and those needs will change over time. And what worked today might not work tomorrow, it might work next week, and it might not work next year. And sometimes parents say to me, oh, but last year you said he could do this. Yes, but that was last year. And for a child of 4 or 5, last year was a really, really long time ago. So we need to keep thinking about what's working now and what can we do, and let's see if we need to review that. It doesn't necessarily work to any sort of agreed timescale that you can put in your calendar. Inclusion as well is a relatively new thing here. In Dubai, the first inclusive framework only came in 4 years ago. This is not like the UK where this goes back much further. So we're really on the very, very beginning of a journey here. Listen to others. You need to find out what your parents think of inclusion provision. What do your pupils say about how you're meeting their needs and what their experiences are of being in your school? Give your colleagues time to ask questions and discuss what they need and give their views. One of the things that we're working on this year is the Send Inclusion Award, and as part of that, we ran a parent focus group. Feedback was really, really positive, but there are a couple of things that they said. It would be great if we could come into school more often than we do, and we know that at the minute, under the current restrictions, that's something that we can't fix. But they also said, thanks for giving us this opportunity. We've loved being a part of this focus group. And could we do something like this again? And while we don't need a focus group every month, what we are setting up is a parent support network. And I have a fantastic inclusion governor who's helping to run this side of things. And as a parent of a child with additional needs herself, she's walked in their shoes in a way that I will never have done. I don't have that experience myself. And you'll find when you talk to people who work in inclusion that quite often they do have that experience, and that's what's led them down that path. So there's lots that we can learn from other people. As I said, some people are in a team of one. If you do have a team of colleagues who work in your inclusion department, then there's an opportunity always for you to upskill them and to give them your trust. So know when to delegate, when to guide, when to advise, and when to just step back. A lot of the people on my team have moved from being a class teacher into being a part of the inclusion team. It's a different way of working, but it's a very, very rewarding one. It can be a challenge as the team grows to sort of keep it top of it all, to make sure that they're still having CPD that's relevant for them. We do some specialist things that really work for us, which perhaps the rest of the school don't need to know. And we carry on learning from each other. We all have different experiences, and we just keep on sharing those. Be a victim of your own success. If inclusive practice is the norm, we won't even notice anymore that we're doing it. It will just happen. That's not to say I will do myself out of a job, but some parts of my job I won't need to do anymore. With behaviour being communication, I talked about the lower arousal approach that we've adopted. This actually doesn't just go for pupils. It goes for parents. It goes with colleagues as well. Anger is often rooted in fear and stress. In my job, I am often the first person who says to a parent, I think your child has additional learning needs. And you know the saying about don't shoot the messenger? It happens, but you've got to have an ongoing relationship with that family. And I always say, I know it's a lot to take in. I want you to have time. You know, if the parents are together, I don't want to give that message to one parent. I'll say, is it possible that I can talk to both of you together? Because they'll need each other's support. They're not always receptive. I have learned to be okay with that because it's their child and it's their choice. And sometimes that takes time. So sometimes it can be difficult to deal with the negative feedback and comments that you get from others who feel threatened and uncomfortable with the message that you're giving, and it just takes patience and understanding. Networking is really important, especially if you're the lone voice of inclusion in your school. It might be in your city, your region, your school group. As I said, I'm lucky to be part of ISP, and we have a regular meeting of head of inclusion in our school group in our area, and even worldwide. You know, why set limits on networking? And that's again where things like LinkedIn and Twitter can come in. Partnerships add enormous value. For us, our partnership with the Hammam Centre is just absolutely key to what we do. Sometimes just having somebody there with their level of expertise makes a big difference. I did a reading assessment on a child quite recently and really found the way that the child was speaking was something that didn't really give me a cause for concern, but I just wanted some further advice on it. And as part of my assessment, I was recording the child's reading so that I could listen to it again and make sure I was marking correctly. And I was able to share that with our speech and language therapist and say, can you listen to this? I'm not going to tell you who it is or anything about them, but can you just listen to this and tell me whether you think it's something I need to follow up? So having somebody that you've got access to like that is fantastic. And we've also just started to get to know the team at Sanad Village, which is a local centre here for children with a range of special learning needs. And they are a fantastic provider of all sorts of different services, looking at preparing children for adulthood, for the world of work, for giving them opportunities. They're based in Sustainable City in Dubai. And although we're only at the very beginning of our relationship with them, we are really looking forward to spending some time working with them. This is a quote I just wanted to put in there because if you're part of the inclusion team in your school, you are generally a small team, sometimes an exceptionally small team in the time of private schools that often have 2,000 to 3,000 pupils. Often those year group teams and phase teams are much, much bigger than the inclusion team, but a small team committed to a cause bigger than themselves can achieve absolutely anything. So that's part of my mission. Some sources of support that I thought might be helpful. They are quite UK focused, but in Dubai, a lot of what you read in the inclusion frameworks here are very heavily adopted from the UK Code of Practice. And I think it's got a lot of value in other areas in our region as well. So the top 3 websites that you'll find assorted support and resources on. The smiley man with the beard in the top right corner is Gareth Morwood. He was the person who did our training for the low arousal approach, and he also has his own blog. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, you can get in touch with me and you can get in touch with Gareth. And that lady in the bottom corner is Pookie Knightsmith. You can also find on Twitter at PookieH. And she's part of the team at Creative Education, and they do some amazing free courses, webinars, and some paid content as well. They do things for parents. They've done all sorts of stuff around well-being, not just special needs. And Pookie herself has autism and has a really good insight into that. They've done some work on autism in girls, which can present quite differently to boys. So there's lots of resources on Creative Education site that lots of people would find really valuable. And finally, Parkinson's Law, which I said resonated very much with Olly and I when we talked about this briefly before we started the show.
Yep.
It's true for leaders of all subjects, I think especially so in education. I have, as a class teacher, as an inclusion teacher, been known to spend possibly an hour working on preparing a lesson that I will deliver in 10 minutes flat. It's not a good use of your time. I've had to learn I can't be all things to all people. I can't meet all of the needs of all of the children. They won't all fit in our school anyway. And if I put in a small amount of work and a small amount of time and give it the right amount of effort, then it will get done. The to-do list in this job is absolutely endless. As a growing school, we're always planning ahead and preparing for next year. And just don't let things get on top of you. Don't let it run away with you. If you can just say, right, I'm going to give this half an hour, I'm going to get it finished, often that's the best way of doing it.
Thank you, Ginette. I was trying to take some notes on that. There was so many things that I want to ask you, and I hope I can get through some of them. I want to start with something you mentioned really early on that I think is hugely important, and not necessarily through an educator's fault, but quite often we can fall back into old habits. So going to looking beyond the label, what advice do you have for teachers, leaders, schools on redefining the language in their own school around inclusion?
You just start with the child. Get to know the child, talk to them, ask them what it is they want from school. What do they find difficult? Now, they're not a teacher. They won't have the insight that you as a teacher have. They won't know what you can provide. But sometimes you find important things out just from asking them that you might not have anticipated. For example, a child in year 3, when we were putting his pupil passport together, who said, I don't like sitting near the door. I just find it really distracting. Yeah, and this isn't a child who's got ADHD. This is actually a child with dyslexia. But he just said, that's really hard for me. And it can be something simple as that. And you go, well, that's an easy fix. Some of the things that you can do cost absolutely nothing. They don't inconvenience anybody. They don't take up any time. And you can just do that. And that child's experience is instantly better. So you just need to get to know them and what works for them, and be prepared, as I said, to know that it will change over time.
Yeah, I like how instantly you started there with relationships, and it reminds me of something you said really on, actually. I think before we were in your presentation, where you don't look at a child's experience through a teacher's planning. You look at it through the eyes of the student in the classroom, in their context. And those two things really resonate with me. And you shared then later on kind of, what is best practice for inclusive practice. In terms then of, because you mentioned a few different examples of frameworks, for anyone out there that is writing their own framework or is in a context where there is no kind of regional, local, national framework, which frameworks across the globe would you recommend and why for those educators to draw on?
It depends on your curriculum. If you're in a British curriculum setting, then the UK Code of Practice is a really, really good place to start. And most of what you see, I think, in the UAE is very much based upon that, especially if you consider that our school inspectors tend to be British as well. These are the people who are familiar with it, because they're often Ofsted inspectors when they're back in the UK. And I'm sure they are looking forward to coming back here more than we are looking forward to them coming back here. So that's a really good place to start. It's a huge document, and don't attempt to read all of it. And again, that can be where organisations like NASEN can be very, very helpful. And it's distilling that down into the key things that you need to know. And one of the things that we lack is that statutory obligation that you have in the UK. So your child with significant needs has an education, health and care plan. And that comes with it a promise and a contract between the local authority and the family. And then the school as the provider that says your child has a place in this school, and we're going to make sure that works for you. And we're going to monitor their provision and their progress. And we're going to do that on a yearly basis. And we're going to give the school some funding to make sure, as best as we can, and of course, money is always limited, that your child has the support that they need in school so that they succeed. And we often have to have very different conversations with parents here, where we have to say, your child needs extra support in school. This is how much it's going to cost you. That's not comfortable. So a lot of the Code of Practice works around that side of the provision. And so we're completely walking a different path here.
Contextually then, what are the other kind of main differences between the UK Code of Practice and the UAE in your context, the Dubai framework?
There's certainly a lot of overlap. There are some things that they have moved away from that I think we keep, like the way in which provision is documented. My early IEPs at my present school did not include anywhere on them the diagnosis that the child had. And with the latest framework, I'm required to put that on. I'd prefer not to, but it has to be there.
Why would you prefer not to? Just is that purely from moving away from labeling students?
Yeah, because again, so if you've taught one child with autism, you've taught one child with autism or with dyslexia, you can just swap that word out. You can learn a lot you can do master's level courses in autism, in dyslexia, in different areas of learning needs, but it will only speak in generalizations, and you always have to come back to the child and their experience. If you've got a child in school who's got a visual impairment, for instance, I've worked with a child in the UK who has a visual impairment. She was registered blind, but she could read regular sized text as long as the book was close enough to her face. If you put something on the floor in front of her, she couldn't see it, but she could see if she brought the book here, despite being registered blind. So even then you can talk about, I've got a child with visual impairment, but you could have 8 children with visual impairment, and their experiences and their needs would be very different, and what you could do to support them would be different. You can't generalize anything like that, really.
And that, I think, comes back to when you were sharing what matters most in leadership of inclusion. You had on one of your slides recognizing the strengths, not the difficulties, for each individual. And actually, are you, or I think you had, what do we need to do?
And what do we need to do so that our school works for your child? Yeah,
that was it. And I think those things all tie in together quite nicely. I'm no expert on this content, so I'm learning as we go, and it's nice to hear you say the same thing, actually, that not only you frame yourself as a lifelong learner, which I think is really important. How what's your advice then on moving within a classroom context to ensuring that you're always changing your mindset to recognize strengths of students and not difficulties?
I think that's the interesting thing. You have to catch yourself doing it, because it's really, really easy. When I'm marking those master's level assignments in the Senko course, what do you think I see first? The things they've done well or the things they've done wrong? the mistakes that they've made. Yeah, and it's so easy. And I know that that's what those delegates want to know. They want to know how to make their work better. And I have to remember, it would be really, really nice for them if I say, you made a really good point, that you've explained that really well. I like the way you've analysed that research, and it's the same with inclusive practice. You've just got to think about, it really worked for that child when you did this. And not just, well, he couldn't do that because you didn't do this.
And on that kind of, I guess, feedback loop, turning it on its head back to the teacher, then what sort of, I guess, professional learning do you think every teacher should have access to ensure they are upskilling themselves for the betterment of all learners in their classroom?
I think that's got to be a whole school program. So as an evolving school, our CPD plans are done sometimes. We start to put together, we're always working on next term, we're always working on the term after that. Sometimes it's recognizing that, yes, there are lots and lots of things that are important at school, but you need to add in sessions, talk about inclusive practice. So, because what you do for those children with additional learning needs benefits everybody. Nobody loses out because you stick a visual timetable up on the board. Lots of children like to know what's coming next. They like the consistency and the security and not too many surprises. One of the things I worked on quite early on was with a child who was getting really anxious in school. And I realized when I went in there on several occasions that the child was always sitting in a different seat. And I said to the teacher, do you have any sort of a seating plan? Clearly pre-COVID times, because now everybody's got a seating plan. And he said, no, they just sit where they like. I said, when you go to a conference and you have a look around and you scout out, and I always need to sit near the door because I like to get out in a hurry if I want to and not feel hemmed in. I don't like to be surrounded by people. So you decide on a place that suits you, that you feel comfortable. You put your stuff down, you get your pens in your bag ready, put your coat on your chair to make sure nobody nicks it. What if you go to lunch and when you come back, somebody else is sitting there? How do you feel? Yeah. And we feel usurped. We feel uncomfortable. We feel like, okay, so I don't belong here anymore. And I don't want to go and sit over there because now I've got to go and build a relationship with those strangers that I haven't spent any time with. And I've just got to know those people. If you don't have any sort of a seating plan or consistency in your classroom, if you've got a child with anxiety or a child with social communication or speech and language needs, you put them through that several times every day. And again, it's a simple, easy, free fix for that child. Just helps them feel more secure and that they know what's coming up.
Yeah, and it's little things like that quite often people might not think about. Are there any other things that another example that you can kind of rattle off that, dare I say it, common mistakes people might make that are really easily avoidable?
Sometimes just little simple things, that make people go, why didn't I think of that? A child in FS2 who, not because she's also learning Arabic, but just because she hasn't got her dominant hand and her brain development in the right place yet, kept writing, starting from the right-hand corner and writing left, even when she was writing in English. And I said, just get a Sharpie on her whiteboard, just draw a little picture of a pen in the top left-hand corner to remind her where to start. And the teacher just went, that's so simple. That is so obvious. Why didn't I think of that? It's just one of those really, really simple things that you can do. So when the child picks up their whiteboard, they go, there's the pen. That's where I start.
Yeah, it's, as you'll know, teachers quite often are time pressured, and any little quick reminders, and which are actually just quick wins like that, are always go down well. Especially,
again, the same thing, verbal feedback. Just because you said it doesn't mean that they remember it. Yes, we're trying to move away from marking. We're certainly trying to move away from writing long, long sentences in the books of children who can't read. So it's right that you should give feedback verbally, but don't assume the children are going to remember it, because they can't act on it if the next lesson, maybe you told them that you really wanted them to work on finger spaces, but that was yesterday. So you need to tell them again or give them a visual reminder. And I can't stress enough the importance of those little visual things. Working with a teacher, working with a child in year 1 who said, I count it out, we rehearse his sentence, we say it out loud, we count how many words he's got to write, and then I leave him to it. And it just seems to stop there. He doesn't write anything. I said, because he probably can't remember what you just said. So get a whiteboard, draw a line for each word that he needs to write so he can see, I've done that one, I've done that one, I've got 2 left. We've got these little TTS little sort of speaker recorder things. You know, they're literally no bigger than an egg cup. And said, get him to record his sentence into that. And then he can play it back and listen to it when you're not there to repeat it for him. And then like a week or 2 later, she said, it's so much better. You know, now he's getting more work done. He's remembering more of the words. He's not missing so much out. It's not perfect because he's still finding it hard, but he's much more independent. And that's another thing we always have to keep in our minds is, how can I support this child to be an independent learner? They have to be able to do it when you're not there.
And a nice little purposeful use of technology there to support teaching and learning,
Yeah.
which always goes down well on this show. You mentioned as well in your presentation, be a victim of your own success. Kind of with that in mind, along with, because we were talking a bit before the show about last week's show, could you share an example of when you've been 10% braver, please, Ginette?
I think I can give you a couple of examples. One, my first ever live webinar, which was a really big step for me. So can I talk about inclusion for an hour and a half non-stop? It turns out that yes, I can. I could probably have gone on. And also moving to another country to take up a job in a curriculum that you don't know, using a framework which has been in print for 5 minutes, you know, that was a big step. And just making that first leap from mainstream teaching into the inclusion arena. I said I went into it as a class teacher of 10 years experience and a senior leader of 3 years experience, but I had never done it. And I look back on myself now as an NQT and an early career teacher, and I realize how little I knew. And I don't forget that when I'm supporting teachers, because I know that I had some quite complex children in my first few classes and year groups. I mostly taught in Key Stage 1. And I really knew very, very little about how to meet their needs.
That's a really honest assessment there. Thank you for that. It reminds me a little bit of, I think it was the physicist in me coming out. I think it was Richard Feynman that said, the more you, or it might have been Carl Sagan, the more you think you know about something, the more you realize you don't know. And quite often education can feel a little bit like that. The more the more you learn around a particular topic, the broader your horizons get, but the more you realize, actually, I don't know much about this at all, which can be quite a daunting prospect. So how most students in our classrooms feel, when faced with all of the challenges of schooling. I'm really mindful of time now, Ginette. I'm going to ask you one last question, if that's okay, and that is, what 2 or 3 things do you hope is at the forefront of leaders' minds with a view to the next academic year starting in September?
Supporting transition. I think if you're talking about inclusion leaders, supporting transition is really important, and that starts now. That's not something that we do in the last week in August. It's something that we're already thinking about. How can we make it work for those children? None of us know at the moment. I know you've had some recent announcements in Abu Dhabi, but certainly in Dubai, none of us know what next year is going to look like. We don't know whether we're losing the social distancing, the masks, the bubbles, whatever. We don't know what it's going to look like, but we've got a whole school of children who only know the children in their class. And for our youngest children, their only experience of school has been school in COVID times. And we need to think about what their experiences are going to be like as we resume our normality. We know what it used to be like. Lots of our children, I mean, a third of our children, possibly more, only joined our school this year. we have got whole classes of children who only joined our school this year. You know, there's not one child in that room who was here last year. And so for those children, again, they don't know what Aquila School looks like before COVID. And so we need to lead them and support them along that path and help them adjust to post-COVID, hopefully one day, post-COVID school and what that looks like, and start to get back to normal and to celebrate the things that we can do together that we haven't been able to do this year.
And I think that'll open up a whole new horizon for those students. Just being able to access, you know, what a school was, I guess. And that sounds a bit sad, sort of saying that. And I know that it's at the forefront of most teachers that I talk to, is getting back to school, normal school. And that's hugely important, I think, for everybody, for teachers as well, I think. To be able to sort of share in the joy of education pre-COVID times. I'm hugely looking forward to that. I hope that it can happen, but time will tell on that one. Ginette, we're just over an hour now. I'd just like to publicly say thank you very much once again for giving up your time to come on the show and share this evening. If anyone wants to follow you online, they can find you on social media using your handle at Inclusion UAE. I've tweeted loads whilst you've been presenting and shared some of your top tips. So please do look out for Ginette on Twitter. If anyone wants to get involved, then just as a final for anyone that's tuned in slightly later on, anyone wants to get involved in the Special Needs and Inclusion Teachers Network Middle East and Africa, please do either find Ginette's posts on LinkedIn or search for Special Needs and Inclusion Teachers Network on Facebook, and you can join in that professional learning network and engage in not only your own learning, but improving the learning of the students in your schools. Ginette, thank you very much. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we end the show?
Just thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
You're more than welcome. The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone that has tuned into the show or has watched this back at a later date. See you in season 3. Bye-bye, everyone.